Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Samuel Raybone, and I'm delighted to be chairing this conversation between Laurel Garber and Brittany Luberda on the theme of Impressionism across media. This webinar is organised under the umbrella of Impressionist Futures, an international research group which aims to raise new questions and advance innovative approaches towards a collaborative and expansive rethinking of Impressionism. If you haven't already, we'd love for you to sign up to our newsletter so we can keep in touch about future events and projects via this link or by signing up on our website, impressionistfutures.com. There are two upcoming events that I'd like to really quickly highlight. In November, Diana Seave Greenwald will be in conversation with Susan Waller about the Isabella Stewart Gardner's Museum's exhibition Manet, A Model Family. And I'm delighted to announce for the first time that in January, Harman Siegel will be talking with Carmen Rosenberg Miller about his latest book, Painting with Monet. More details on that will be shared soon via our website and our newsletter. But returning to the present, I'm so pleased to welcome Laurel and Brittany to discuss the multimedia and intermedial aspects of Impressionism, because both of them are working at the crest of a wave of attention and enthusiasm about Impressionism beyond the canvas, and at the cutting edge of new approaches to construct a more holistic and integrated account of Impressionism's many and mixed media. Recent books and exhibitions have brought to light the Impressionists' nuanced engagement with ideas of the decorative and how their aspirations towards decoration shaped the subjects, forms, formats, and materials in which they worked. These innovations transformed the meaning and purpose of their oil painting and pushed Impressionists to diversify and hybridize their practice across various decorative media. We're increasingly attentive to the materials which mediated Impressionists' engagements with modernity and modern art, from chemical colour to carbon rod arc lights. And likewise, new histories are placing Impressionism within the lens of novel visual technologies, including photography and the cinematograph. New research is increasingly highlighting the importance of printmaking for Impressionism as a space for experimentation in which Impressionist concepts took on new aspects, thanks to the distinctive materials, techniques, and processes of various print media. Prints were a crucial element in the Impressionist exhibitions, and a superabundance of prints in artistic monochrome and crass colour was a defining characteristic of the modern life that the Impressionists painted and printed and decorated, and so much more. The format for today's webinar is that Laurel and Brittany are going to give 7-minute lightning presentations about their current work in progress. And it's a real privilege for us to see sort of behind the scenes about this work in progress. I'm really excited to see the presentations. After which I'll ask them 2 or 3 questions. They have some questions for each other, and then we'll open up to questions from you, the audience. So you have about an hour 15, an hour 20 in total, so plenty of time for your questions in that final section. Please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A feature as we go through. My wonderful colleagues from Impressionist Futures, Alison Deutsch, Alexis Clark, and Claire Moran are here on the call and will help me sort of collate them and save them up for the future. So please do pop them in as we go through, and we'll store them up. So then, without any more from me, I'm pleased to properly now introduce our 2 speakers. Laurel Garber is the Park Family Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she works with a collection of modern and contemporary works on paper. Most recently, Laurel co-organised the exhibition Mary Cassatt at Work. Brittany Luberda is the Anne Stone Associate Curator of Decorative Arts at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she curates a collection of 8,000 objects and furniture from Europe and America. She has recently worked on several exhibitions and major installations, including Free Will, Making Art in Early Maryland, Recasting Colonialism, Michelle Erickson's Ceramics, Baltimore Addressed, Baker Artists Awards, and She Knew Where She Was Going, G's Bend Quilts and Civil Rights. So we'll start with Laurel and then go straight through into Brittany's presentation, and then we'll go into the discussion. So I'm pleased to invite Laurel to take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing. Okay. Sorry, I can't quite see. Daniel, can you let me know if it looks okay?
Yeah, that's working great.
Great. Thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to Samuel, Claire, Allison, and Alexis, and also to Brittany. I've just enjoyed so much your programming and events, and I'm really thrilled to be participating, and I thank you so much for all the work you're doing on this program and all the other ones. Perhaps the most striking thing that appears when we put print back into the frame of Impressionism is the realization that it was there from the beginning. The inaugural 1874 exhibition of the Société Anonyme featured over 40 prints, as the show now at the National Gallery in DC demonstrates with great clarity. And all but one of the subsequent 7 exhibitions included a significant amount of graphic art. Similarly, many of the leading Impressionist painters doubled as radical and innovative printmakers, including, most notably, Mary Cassatt, Edgar Degas, and Camille Pissarro. And yet print has largely remained a footnote in the history of Impressionism. But where could correcting this art historical record get us? If, as Andrei Dombrowski writes, Impressionism opened a view onto some of the most vexing and crucial questions of the late 19th century, then how might a revised focus on Impressionist printmaking affect our understanding of that view? Do different questions emerge under the pressures of different media? That's indeed one of the lines of inquiry that prompted our program today. And in the case of print in particular, I believe the answer to this question is yes. So briefly today, I'd like to present some of the thinking that I and other recent scholars of Impressionist printmaking have been doing on these questions in order to sketch what I see as some of the most promising potential answers. As we've begun to better appreciate intaglio printmaking's enduring importance to the artists and critics who made Impressionism, scholars have begun to examine its Impressionist bona fides. What has emerged as a result of that claim, what has emerged as a result of the claim that, far from being objects of secondary importance, prints by Impressionist artists embody the poetics of Impressionism in ways that painting cannot. Art historian Holly Clayson has perhaps articulated this claim most strongly, arguing that prints actually comprise the Impressionist object par excellence. For Clayson and for scholar Ashley Dunn, the fundamental mutability of the print matrix allows it to capture and express the ephemerality of the artistic gesture that Impressionists sought. It's the printing plate's capacity to be perpetually worked and reworked, what Dunn calls its structural open-endedness, that enables its responsiveness to the ongoing process of art making. Whereas in painting, each mark on a canvas overwrites the one before it, print allows the maker to capture each shifting impression through trial proofs, state changes, and variable inkings and printings. Artists such as Félix Drachmond, Cassatt, Degas, and Ludovic Napoleon Lepic made much of this, displaying radically unfinished or processed prints alongside signed final versions. Once it was attached to original artistic gestures, printmaking's reproducibility began to signify in new ways, less as mechanistic than as boldly artistic and modern in Baudelaire's sense of the transitory, fugitive, and contingent. As it moves through the material realities of printmaking, Impressionism's familiar questions of visual perception may take a backseat to questions of handwork, materiality, and aleatory techniques. One never really knows what a print is going to look like in advance. My own work seeks to show how such a shift in attention to the hand returns us to the social and aesthetic contingencies of Impressionism and modern art, to their contradictory processes of making. For instance, if it's true that print's mutability could serve Impressionist ends, it is equally the case that key features of printmaking strain against those very ends. As hard as artists and critics sought to redefine print as an autographic medium, and they tried very hard, it's difficult to get around the fact that printmaking actually mediates artistic intention quite thoroughly. Before it can be realized in print, an artist's idea needs to pass through obdurate materials, transformational chemical processes, and the hands of a or several printers, and the wheels of the press. This tension arguably lies at the heart of the Impressionist print. And this tension is, I argue, social as well as aesthetic, which we can illustrate briefly by looking at two sets of prints side by side. One by the master printer Auguste Delattre, the self-declared artiste imprimeur of 19th century Paris, and the other by Ludovic Napoleon Lepic, who exhibited in the first and second Impressionist exhibitions with 42 works in 1876, some of which I'm showing here, and that was more than any other artist. The prints by Delattre from 1861 are models of his distinctive technique of retroussage, or interpretive inking, an approach that he used on other artist plates that involves gently coaxing ink out of the etched lines with a rag and spreading it to adjacent areas of the plate's surface. Such a process produces swaths of inky tone that alter atmosphere and mood while giving extra velvety plumpness to etched lines. Across the 1860s and 70s, Delatre's signature inking became a flashpoint in debates around the art of etching. For many, his ability to manipulate ink in order to vary the expression of the matrix epitomized etching's sensitivity to fluctuating artistic intention. To others, however, this liberty of interpretation by the skilled printer rather than the fine artist was out of bounds, with Pizarro eventually bemoaning Delattre for printing with pots of molasses. In these prints, Delatre's own, we see him experimenting with the full range of his inky innovations, using the rag to transform the image on the matrix, changing the scene's weather and the time of day between passes through the press. And this over a full decade before the first Impressionist exhibition and 3 before Monet's haystack sundials. Delatre's approach to inking was both a spur and a provocation. Here we see perhaps the most pointed response by Lepic, who printed with Delattre through the 1860s and then became one of the most vocal proponents of the artist's responsibility to ink and print their own plates, so as to bypass the mediating role of the skilled printer. Lepic's prints take Delatre's methods to new lengths, here producing 20 unique impressions from the same etched matrix. Lepic inked it to different effect with each pass through the press. From print to print, the manual manipulation of ink on the matrix produces wildly divergent effects of light, shadow, weather, haze, smoke, and other superimposed elements and events on a landscape made to receive every conceivable manifestation of nature's or the artist's whim. Lepic called this practice au forte mobile, or variable etching, and it eventually led him to abandon the etched matrix altogether in a way that directly stimulated Degas' experiments in monotype. In his essay, La Nouvelle Peinture, published to coincide with the second Impressionist exhibition in April 1876, Louis-Edmond Duranty expounds on Lepic's prints as emblematic of the Impressionist breakthrough. Quote, "One must recognize that in this movement almost everything is new or wants to be free. Even printmaking torments itself over technique. Here it is, varying each etched plate, brightening it, mysterizing it, literally painting it by means of an ingenious handling of ink at the moment of printing, end quote. What the history of print can remind us is that such breakthroughs never emerge fully formed, as if from Zeus's head. Putting Impressionism back in touch with Lepic and Lepic back in touch with Delattre clarifies some lines of influence, but more, it helps us see where those lines might start, with a printer, in fact. But what I find most significant in this example is just how clearly Lepic's technical and aesthetic innovations emerge here as solutions to a social problem of how to reformulate the subject of the artist in homage to, yet at a distance from, the position of the skilled laborer, the printer. In Lepic's treatise on automobile, which he titled How I Became an Etcher, he makes these social stakes plain. I'm quoting here, "By printing myself my plate of the views from the banks of Lescaut, I finally realized my dream. I obtained the most varied and most contrary effects, something that had become impossible when etchings were pulled by a printer instead of by the artist himself," end quote. In the dream of replacing the printer with the artist, I find an important example of what can be gained from an intermedial impressionism, namely a renewed sensitivity to how our familiar aesthetic values had to be made and remade, including those of single authorship, the stable identity of the artist, and the superiority of originality over reproduction, to name just a few. Impressionism remains a meaningful category of study, not least because it has become so influential in shaping those values. By the same token, an impressionism across media helps to reopen impressionism itself to the contingencies and struggles within and beyond art history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was fantastic. Questions are already coming in through the Q&A. If they come to you, please do use that feature. We'll store them all up through the end. I'm sure, like me, you've got loads of questions, but for now, I'm really happy to hand over to Brittany. So just to let you know, Brittany, you're still on mute.
Let's see what that does. Do you see three-dimensional impressionism?
We can hear you, but we can't see your screen yet.
Oh. How do we feel about that?
There we go. Yes. So we can see your slides. That's great.
Is it in presentation mode?
Not quite yet. So if you click that button, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Samuel. For the 100th time, it feels at this moment, for organizing this, and also for the workshop, for inviting me to speak, and especially for Laurel, for sharing this virtual roundtable on Impressionism across media. So today I'm sharing a research endeavor in the exhibition ideation stage, which I hope will conclude in a traveling presentation and publication many years away. This research analyzes the Impressionist and post-Impressionist period in late 19th century through pigment, clay, glass, metal, and wood in aesthetic and theoretical dialogue. Like the Impressionists, circles of French ceramicists, goldsmiths, glass artists, and furniture makers flouted illusion and pattern in favor of organicism, temporal suspension, and abstraction. My research questions whether the radical transformations in technique, in subject, and in modes of making and display which define Impressionism are found across media. To explore this subject, I have two parallel pursuits: the identification of Impressionist artists who created furniture, ceramics, glass, metalworks, and fiber arts, point one there, and point two, a reconsideration of late 19th century French artists in the applied or decorative arts who broke from national or formal directives and adopted like and equally innovative practices as the Impressionists. In terms of principally painters and printmakers umbrellaed by the Impressionist expositions commencing in 1874 and the post-Impressionist movements which followed in the 80s and early 1900s, here's a sampling of artists I'm exploring who've developed touchable, turnable, and transportable pieces. On the left is a cabinet by Emile Bernard, likely made in 1891 to 1893 in Pont-Aven, when he was working on synthetisme. On the top is a fan design in the Baltimore Museum of Art collection by Edgar Degas, a gorgeous gouache with powdered silver on cotton. On the bottom is a ceramic painted by Marie Cassatt between 1905 and 1908. And at the right is a hand mirror from 1900 at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which espouses the collaborative nature of many works in this period, including designs by Félix Bracquemond, Auguste Rodin, Alexander Riquet, and Alexis Faliz in the production process. One thing that keeps returning in this study is certain artists' passion for an immersive environment. And in the case of the Toulouse-Lautrec designed Louise Comfort Tiffany window from 1894 to 5 at left, here the study of light and nature is actualized by daylight and nightlight itself seen streaming through the glass. I'm very envious of anyone on this Zoom who was in Paris in 2022 and was able to see d'Orsay's exhibition at l'Orangerie, Le Décor Impressionniste, the source of the nymphs, where the curators confronted a history of site specificity in Impressionism, contextualizing the monumentality of Monet's water lily paintings and a demonstrated history of Impressionist painting on walls and doors, dissolving interior and exterior. This trompe-l'oeil conservatory for the doors in his dining room by Caillebotte at center and the seascape on an armoire door by Monet at right were included in that groundbreaking show. The most recently and most expansively studied multimedia artist of this period might be Gauguin, who deftly moved between materials, applying subjects, textures, and tools betwixt substrates. At the left, I've included the BMA's figural portrait of a Tahitian woman, beside a ceramic of a woman bathing, possibly influenced by the artist's recent trip to Martinique. Above this is an animated tree-form vase, and at the right is the Art Institute's stunning cupboard, co-created by Gauguin and Bernard, which is a collage of carved references to Martinique and Brittany. The Gauguin as Alchemist exhibition catalog proposed that Gauguin use the same tools to make wood blocks as furniture, which I found especially appealing for this discussion. Subjects translated across medium are prominent in Gauguin's work, and again I've read about Gauguin going to study with Ernest Chaplet, who I know through decorative arts texts as one of the most innovative ceramicists in the late 19th century. As we compare the two artists, the shared subject here is obvious. It's likely that Chaplet made the form on the left and instructed Degas on how to glaze the piece. This question emerged for me, though. Why did Gauguin choose Ernest Chaplet? How did he find him? Who was he to the Impressionists? And research follows that both Pissarro and Degas in the 1870s through Bracquemond experimented with Haviland, Chaplet's employer. Gauguin's narrative arrives, though, at a particularly thrilling moment in Haviland history and also Chaplet's life history. Chaplet was apprenticed at the Sèvres National Factory at age 18 and went on for 20 years to work at a Royal Faience factory before joining Haviland, an international manufacturer based in Limoges. In 1882, he heads a Parisian atelier as an independent studio with the sculptor Damuse. The backing, I should note, however, is from Haviland. Looking at Chaplet's trajectory from the 1870s through 1900 on the screen, you can see an absolute transformation away from a decorative service over a ceramic body to the medium becoming the subject of the work. Ornamentation dissolves and the abstract design consumes the whole. Notably, he's always innovative. So at far left, if you're looking from left to right in these pieces, if you're sensing a Puvis de Chabannes monochrome or two-toned work at left, it was very radical to leave raw stoneware exposed as a part of your image in 1870. And then at far right, as you see a progression through like a high Japonisme in 1880, and then the two pieces at right when he has this freedom in his funded atelier, you can see that he delves into glaze experimentation and the porcelain surface, even at the far right. My favorite element is the bottom left, where he's just left white porcelain glazed for you as part of the whole. I should say to make this, Chapelain's also doing this with the work. So he's allowing his body and nature to kind of move the glaze over the piece, and then of course the fire in the kiln to also affect it. So it's a very tactile, engaged form of creating dependent on nature. Within this research, then, I'm aiming to construct a wider history of shared subject matter. And you can see, I think, easily this purpose here with Japonisme, with a Gerard fan on the left, the Cassatt portrait of a woman in that upholstered chair with the fan at the rear, and then this golden chapelet vessel with birds, which I believe really expresses for us this cross-pollination between materials that I'm working to expose in this presentation. Pierre-Adrien Dalperat, the ceramicist at left, was a radically innovative potter and glazer, working in Limoges and then in Paris in the 1880s. This phase at left inspired this research. Dalperat, like Van Gogh at right, has suspended time. We're looking at the swell of a wave with its frothy curls coming up, reaching and pausing just at the crest of a turn. And then the three-dimensionality of this is so important too, because the wave continues as it sort of spirals upward and outwards. It's red because Dalperat is showing off his ability to create sang de boeuf, which is an oxblood glaze, which is a copying Chinese porcelain. To walk you through just one or two more subjects which fall into this cross-pollination, here on the right, Clément Massier is a ceramicist working with Levi Dermer in the Guachuan in southeastern France. And if you look very closely, you can see the butterflies that are flying up this phase, which bears so much resemblance to works, for example, like by Redon at left, and certainly the symbolist movement. Levi Dermer, most people on the call may know through his works on paper and through his paintings, but he spent a good decade working with Massier, glazing in his factory. And you can see that the subjects that he takes up on the surface of his pieces, like coral, like conifer trees, like starbursts in the sky, are all drawn from nature and all this bright and vibrant moment in history. And the conifers merely there next to the Van Gogh because of the cypress tree. The most interesting conversation I've had in this developing research has been about seriality. And I'm very happy that my talk has followed Laurel's in that ceramicists like Massier are using the same form, but then varying the glaze over time to capture various times of day through the firing process and through the oxides chosen. And I am very eager to continue conversations with colleagues who specialize in this moment of thinking about uniqueness and seriality, and want to add that there are artists who have fallen in the decorative arts field who are very much experimenting with the same subject at the same time. So I want to close with this out of time, almost, 1890s abstract dish by Chapelain, to say that the aim of this project is to bring into dialogue friends and collaborators divided previously by scholastic outlines of Art Nouveau, arts and crafts, and Impressionism, hopefully revealing a symbiotic reimagining of line, color, and time across media. and to offer for us consideration of these works to be included in an Impressionist discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure applause is resounding on the other end of the webinar in everybody's rooms. Thank you both for those really, really rich presentations. My sort of first question to you both was going to be quite broad, but it's something that you've sort of, I think, actually sort of covered actually in your presentation. So maybe I'll pose it with the expectation that you might want to give a briefer answer. But lots of really interesting connections and crossovers that I'm sure we'll sort of get into the detail of. But my first question, as I say, is quite broad, and it sort of relates to this idea of impressionism across media. And I was wondering whether I could sort of just start the conversation by asking, what does that phrase mean to you both in the context of your research and in the context of your fields? How and why might we want to, and how might we achieve a characterization of Impressionism as something that's spanning media in the ways that you're describing?
I can add one element quickly to kick us off. Beyond what I shared in the talk, I've been using this break from a national program, this divergence from political and also a nationalistic agenda that was so apparent in the salons. I've been using and watching artists in other media make a similar break to the narrative that we know from the exhibition's beginning, really in 1863 and then 1874. So part of the definition of Impressionism for me was thinking about the origins of studio craft and tracing that back to a choice to become independent and to experiment. And so that, just as an opener there, I don't think I got to touch on that in my talk, but in addition to things like temporal suspension, to an immersion in nature, to looking to Japan and China. So I move to Laurel.
Thanks. I think the phrase Impressionism across media, or intermedial Impressionism, just for me kind of helps to flag Impressionism as a more variegated, also more kind of capacious and stable category in some ways. It points to something, I think, like well beyond painterly style, maybe, and instead towards something that's a kind of discursive or rhetorical project that is shaping and being shaped by activities in other mediums. So for me, I guess, as a print historian, but also as a curator with a fairly generalist mandate, I find that change pretty exciting because I think it makes Impressionism a little less exceptional, if I may say, while also paying better attention to what is distinctive about it. I guess I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. The idea of it sort of using it sort of apply a bit of pressure to our inherited definition of Impressionism, and seeing that sort of re-emerge as something a bit more sort of contingent and contested and capacious. That's a really nice sort of way to phrase that. And I think as well, one thing that sort of struck me from your presentations was that it sort of also requires or involves a sort of return to the object, a return to processes of making, a return to, as you said, Brittany, studio craft. And sort of both of you, I think, took us really nicely into those processes of making. I got a sense of de Latre with his rag and Lepic with his inking. And I wonder whether you might both want to speak a bit more about how significant that idea of a return to the object, a return to making is, in terms of how you see the critical charge of your projects and how that might be sort of new or innovative.
I could just respond quickly. I mean, I'm just deeply interested in questions of technique and materiality. It's really what where I really begin and end. And I think to me, the specific material histories and constraints of different mediums really matter. I think I made that point. And that's the kind of medium specificity I think I'm interested in, which we've talked a little bit about this, Samuel. I think I see that as distinct from a kind of Greenberg's usage of the term, which I think is, teleological, idealized. So for me, I think it's not that mediums tend toward one essential thing, but that mediums and the particular capacities and techniques of various artists shape our ways of making, knowing, valuing.
Yeah.
And that at the same time, these mediums are really subject to change in themselves. So yeah, I'm excited about where there's some overlap between Brittany and I think especially in terms of Baxter and the hand. And, yeah.
And there's sort of many layers to this question, like from a pure basic technical consistency across multiple media, from me going back to this material, which I think it's been really a decade since I've curated or studied Impressionist painting or paper proper. So it's been a return to the material through the lens of understanding and studying other techniques. So when I've been returning the reading and seeing people like Chevreul, the color theorist, and then realizing that he wrote his textbook for ceramicists and for metalworkers and enamelers, but it keeps appearing in the studies about something influencing Impressionist color theories. That proves to me that there's a basis for people studying color theory with multiple specialties too. So that's something to look at as just like a sort of factual point of shared theories of color and glaze and pigment production at that time. I think the connection between the materials also comes in the artist's own work. So I think this two-poled research process that I have going is really helpful. For example, Degas, I know, painted a tile in 1876. It's not a good tile. I didn't include it. It's not a contribution to tile making at large, but we can look at artists' own practices and see that there is a lot of interest in studying with their friends and exploring what their colleagues are using as a material basis, so much more than I had perceived before. So it's really nice to kind of rewrite in that inclusive sort of
That's really fascinating, because there's a sense, I think, that we're trying to sort of push towards a bit more of a nuanced understanding of artistic creation, which is not only something mediated by the materiality of the process that they're working in. The sort of the print pushes back, and the print imposes itself on that act of creation, and similarly with ceramics. Whether we think about that in terms of sort of agency or just kind of contingency, that idea of the material imposing itself on the artist, but also a more socially embedded idea of creation, as you say, whether that's sort of being mediated through a professional printer or emerging through collaboration in the studio, or having to negotiate these sort of commercial, industrial forms of relationships. So I wonder whether there's something around authorship and creation, and how a more intermedial view, perhaps, how you see that potential, I suppose, for a more nuanced account of artistic creation.
I feel really strongly like I love that you prompted us to talk about industrial production here. Looking at recent Impressionist, like curatorial or Impressionist scholar cross media sort of presentations, you see, for example, the Brackmann plates for Haviland show up often, and you didn't see them in my presentation. I am very interested in people who studied and are specialists in their medium, who are equally innovative and following the same principles. And I notably, like for Chaplet, the most innovative work comes when he's allowed to work independently, when he's sort of able to remove himself further and further from the commercial expectations of sales and production and creating a piece for a mass audience. So that's something just to note too, that like Massier is not making for the masses. Like he's trying to make money. He's making multiple forms with different glazes, but there is an element of uniqueness in metalworking, in furniture making, in ceramics that's akin to the process of making a unique work in a painting. And so I've honed some of my research to those artists working with individual objects or individual productions. Not to say it's not applicable, that Brackbaum's pieces aren't incredibly influential, important for changing mass production, but I'm focused right now on thinking about individual studios.
Okay, interesting. Laurel, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm a little bit losing the thread of your original question, Samuel, but I'll just try to
I can recap, but I suppose really what I was sort of driving at is both of you sort of talk about materiality and the object as something that's sort of shaping artistic intention, creation. Similarly, is the fact that so many of these media require the intervention of third parties, require collaboration. It's sort of also mediated through craftsmen. There's a social stake there. There's the hierarchy there. It sort of destabilizes the artist. So it was perhaps a bit of a broad question, but that's
exactly the crux of it for me, and what I find most interesting about in my case, approaching Impressionism through the lens of printmaking, or I don't know. I guess I keep returning to this kind of like image or figure of an opening up or an opening out of Impressionism in this way that I think Impressionism becomes porous in important ways when we see it through other media. And of course, the point is that these media were also there. We're not just inserting them, but they're part of the very history that's maybe been a little bit underappreciated.
Yeah.
And it gets kind of, for me, exactly. It gets kind of laced with other problems that we can see better, maybe, which were, I think, undoubtedly part of the original kind of mix of forces, but for so many reasons have been a little bit sifted out. So I like the idea of really making Impressionism a question, I guess, this kind of like, or even a problem again, rather than an answer, if only because it actually allows us to see objects in new ways. So like, as I said in the talk, I guess, I'm very interested in kind of situating Impressionism in relation to movements in print history, and especially to the slightly earlier moment of the etching revival, which is really where my own research is. That's where it sits. And in doing so, in kind of vaulting print into a position of aesthetic privilege, which is like really what the project of the etching revival was about, I think leads to a kind of productive shift of our sense of some of the values named by Impressionism. So for me, it's like both that, I guess some of the kind of like airy monumentality of painting gives way a little bit to the kind of restricted chromatics of intaglio printmaking to their smaller scale. But I think even more interestingly to me is that single authorship and kind of authorial intentionality kind of has to yield, even reluctantly, to multiple hands, machines, and really complex and like transformational techniques. So I think it's all, Ashley Dunn has a really beautiful way of thinking about the aesthetics of unfinish in Impressionism and in Impressionist printmaking in particular. And I really like even thinking about the project of Impressionism as itself kind of unfinished and incomplete or contingent and kind of contradictory.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and yeah, it's sort of that's chimes with my thinking as well, and sort of that interesting question of what happens to these very familiar terms. We know what unfinished looks like in the context of a painting, but as you say, it gets sort of it works out sort of differently in different media. And again, there's terms that you sort of simply can't really explore in painting in the same way. I wonder whether I might just ask one more question very, very cheekily before I sort of take a step back, allow you to question each other, and loads of questions coming in on the Q&A. So thank you very much, everyone, for those. We'll definitely get round to those too. But sort of on that topic, I think probably we sort of agree naturally that we want to sort of flatten or do away with media hierarchies. We're not sort of going down the Greenberg route necessarily of medium specificity in any sort of naive way. So in that process, though, I wonder whether you could sort of talk us through how you're conceptualizing, what terms you're using to think of the nature of those relationships in a more flattened way. So what I mean to say is it about processes of translation between media? Is it a process of transference or of hybridization? Where does reproduction fit? Is it a matter of pastiche? How could you sort of put your finger on how you would sort of characterize the kinds of intermedial relationships that you're exploring in your research? I've chosen the absolute hardest question for the last one because your research is in progress.
Yeah,
perhaps just a brainstorm.
I won't be able to put my finger on anything specific, but yeah, I mean, I'm not. Well, I guess I'm not interested in if not a flattening, a kind of a recognition and a historicization. Yeah. So maybe flattening, if flattening means kind of like raising everything up. I don't know if that's, I guess an equally cheeky answer. And I guess I'm just thinking about just coming off of the Mary Cassatt project, which really, I mean, she was just a banner kind of intermedial impressionist artist to really think with. And that was terribly exciting to kind of see the ways that she kind of explored printmaking for what it could uniquely do in her practice. But there were also very kind of palpable ways that we saw her technique in print kind of impacting her painting and vice versa. So I don't know, something like a two-way street, like cross-pollination rather than a flattening.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a helpful corrective, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Historicizing those hierarchies rather than simply just putting them to one side. Okay. Yeah. Brittany, how about you?
I think shared is the word that comes to mind. There's so many shared elements between artists that I've sort of recovered, I think. For example, like Del Perra, who does the wonderful sea vase. He has 7 years of exhibitions at Galerie Georges Champetty. Sometimes it's just after an exhibition by Monet. They have the same gallerist. They're shown in the same street. The same people are coming by. I mean, this is a cheeky part of also working with colleagues and directly in other medium specialties too. Like Chapelet does not want to be a painter. There's no secret desire for Chapelet to be a painter. He wants to be the best ceramicist, in France, and history has put him up there. So I think deep embedded in your question is also what kind of resources we're prioritizing as scholars, what we have looked at, what expositions have we studied? Why these 8? Ceramicists have their own exhibitions in the time period. There are other expositions in which are multimedia in the 80s and 90s, in the 90s in particular in Paris. So for me, it's a bit hard because the prioritization has been so of our contemporary scholarship has been so focused on these particular 8 expositions, and I'm grateful to the 1874 show that's up at the National Gallery right now for doing some of that really disruptive work about how porous the salons are and who's showing and what type of work is showing there. You know, I would guess that many audiences think there was just 8 artists, perhaps, that showed at the the first anonyme, and that it wasn't actually called the Impressionist exhibition. So some great corrective work happening within the fields of painting, and part of the new vision needs to be looking more broadly at what Paris really looks like.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that idea of historicizing it and grounding it in the visual experience of the moment and the stuff that was there and the stuff that people were seeing around, between, before, and after the ones that we have tended to focus on. Hugely important. Well, I wonder whether I might hand over to you both. Maybe one question for each other. I'll have a look at the chat, the Q&A, I should say, as well, and pick out some questions from the audience to talk about after that. So maybe, Laurel, why don't you kick us off with a question for Brittany?
Okay. My question will betray a little bit of my ignorance about ceramics, but it kind of picks up on some of the threads in my work, and also I think one of the questions in the chat, which is about authorship, really. I mean, as you heard in the case of prints, there's very often other actors beside the kind of author artist involved in the production of prints. And I was curious, and maybe you touched on this a little bit, but about how much that's the case with the objects that you're thinking about, whether those kind of put pressure on a kind of single authorial voice. And then this is a little bit connected, and I'm like spitballing here, but I'm just struck by the fact that it seems like in both ceramics and in printmaking, I'm just kind of trying to like find the Venn diagram for us. There is a kind of element of surprise or unknowing until you pull something out of the kiln or lift it off the bed of the printing press. And I don't know, I wondered if you wanted to like think with that a little bit. I mean, I think that kind of, what to call it, like surprise or improvisational kind of agency of whatever, the kiln, the press, whatever, how much that is kind of important to you in thinking about your objects.
Oh, it's huge. And I think I loved what you said about a plate being worked and reworked is in itself impressionistic. It's almost like a glance again and again at something too, in the way that your ability, it's always reflecting a new moment. And that improvisation is the perfect word to describe what might happen. Importantly, the hand in that improvisation is in part nature too, and all of the ways in which the fire might change accidentally, a flake might fall where you want it to, and an embracing of the way in which the person firing, in the case of ceramics, firing the kiln, or someone making an enamel, has to release themselves to the process and let the process drive it, is, I think, a really seductive part of making. And that's, there's an attempt, there's such an attempt pre-1860 to try and control decoration. And it's really about getting all of the calculations right and the design right and hoping the firing works so that something looks precise. And you do see this turn towards whim, whim combined with a kind of manipulation on the case of the artists in the late 19th century, which I find so akin to some of the ways in which I learned about Impressionism. And then to talk about the hand, absolutely. Every time in your exhibition you just put on, and now too, you're repeating the importance of the printmaker and the elevation or appreciation of the printmaker in the process. Feels like the entire directive for the decorative arts field at large right now. It is really a great moment wherein in both museum practice and labels and also in research, acknowledgement that many, many hands go into making the work should be more and more present. So Massier does have a factory. He is not the only person who poured that mold and then applied those glazes. He is working with the team, Levy Dermers there side by side. People do have specialties within the workshop. So I hope that only supports a more pervasive understanding of how artistic interests are changing in the late 19th century. And then, so much to say. Delattre and Lepic are now two favorites, and thank you for so many references to Baltimore there too. That was so nice.
You have the goods there, so you should go look at them. Yeah,
great. I wanted to go back to one of the very first things you pointed out and just note that it's influencing what I need to look at next too, which is a relationship born out of Dombrowski talking about the significance of the imminence maybe of making a work at this time. And it got me to think about function and the function of objects, which are by essence studied because they are functional together often, and how I might think more about function of these furniture and function of these ceramics and how that might follow modern life. I focused a lot on technique and decoration and not enough, I think, on form. So I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit more about functionality of prints as a reflection of modern life. If you had any observations on how, if collecting or seeing, or are you like me and just want to focus on the small atelier studio things that are really experimental and not mass distribution?
It's so interesting. I've literally never, like, the word function has never kind of like been something I have really connected to my work. And I'm so interested in, maybe it's because I'm like so myopically like a prints and drawings person. And I mean, I think there's some, for like, I'll just refer to Cassatt again. I mean, I think she's like deeply interested in exploring printmaking for what it can do, but it's also like there's a way that it can kind of, she can send prints to the United States. She can have them in Paris. There's a kind of way that it kind of, it does kind of expand the presence of her work in more places. So I think there's a kind of, market function to prints often. And I think there's a kind of, a kind of demonstration of a different kind of skill and a kind of connection to a wider audience in some ways, especially as a kind of expat artist. So those are the things that come to mind immediately thinking about function, but I'll admit that it's just not been it'll be helpful to continue to think with that idea. Thank you.
Wonderful, interesting. That idea of function is potentially so rich for the future. Yeah, wonderful. Great. Well, I'm gonna fire some questions at you if you don't mind from our audience who have been typing away. I think clearly everyone just so interested in both your presentations. So thank you once more. I'll start with a question for you, Brittany, from Ashley Dunn, who said it's so exciting to hear about your developing research on three-dimensional impressionism. And she'd like to hear a bit more about how you're sort of building on and conceiving of your project differently than that 2022 Décor Impressionniste exhibition that you mentioned.
Yes, I absolutely. So I admittedly have not finished reading the entire catalog for the exhibition, but what I found provocative about that show is that it explains for me why works ended up as paintings that were conceived of as in situ murals. That felt like the strength of that show when I looked at the types of objects that were displayed, the prevalence of painting on panel, and it was so helpful for me, and I was so grateful also that they kind of embraced a kind of what seemed to be something people wanted to not say, is like, oh, actually this wasn't made to be in a salon or something. At some of the times it wasn't made for a commercial gallery, it was made the meaning exists in its original location. So I found that to be a real strength of the exhibition. One absolute priority for me is to bring those artists and their independent careers, like Ernest Chaplet's independent career, not his relationship with Gauguin, to give that the same weight in the room as we look at Gauguin works, and maybe even more, to be honest, because Gauguin ceramics have their own particular character. But that for me, to really think about people who are working from metalwork, from glass, I know there's gallery works in the show, but I think there's a lot more glass makers working in that time period in creative ways. So it'll be, the idea is a much more multimedia presentation, not working from paintings backwards, but working from ceramics and metalworkers and furnitures forwards in some cases.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can really see that. A question for you, Laurel from Karen Stock, asking, is woodcut part of your research? So she's thinking specifically about Félix Vallotton. Is sort of woodcut within the orbit of the prints that you're looking at?
Not so far, but that's not to say it wouldn't be. I am really rooted, as I was saying, in that kind of etching revival and the kind of particular rhetoric of and around etching in this moment, because it's kind of amazing, the kind of pitch of rhetoric around that technique in particular. Baudelaire, others claim it as this uniquely kind of sensitive medium for registering the kind of modern mind. And so I'm really interested in that particular, like very bizarre, fascinating strain of discourse. So I've been intently kind of focused on intaglio printmaking, but I think thinking about woodcut could help really, or expansively outside of intaglio could help kind of throw things into relief, so to speak, or kind of help think through things. So it's a helpful question.
Interesting. What about lithography? Because there's some crossover in terms of like that idea of the hand of the artist and the fact that it's so much more accessible and easy.
It's so interesting. People in this audience could correct me. I think there's only one or two examples of lithography included in the Impressionist exhibitions. I'm hoping that's the case. I mean, for me, the really interesting questions happen there in terms of the relation between the printer or skilled kind of print people and the artist, because the kind of division of labor is a lot more sharp, I would say. Like Lepic could, I think, make his variable etchings because it was a process he could really do with a press at his home. I think the kind of challenges of working with a lithographic stone, with the kind of intensely chemical and complex like chemistry of lithography is really a kind of limiting factor and kind of defines the role of, I think, the lithographic printer in a way that's really different than the etching printer. So lithography, I think, is really interesting for thinking about those kind of social questions, but also the scale of the sites of printmaking. I mean, you get Le Mercier in the 19th century, and that's a firm that basically is totally kind of industrialized. There's incredible numbers of employees, divisions of labor, piecework, all sorts of things. So that, I think, is really interesting to think about that kind of site as where, some Impressionist prints could come out of.
Fascinating. Well, I suppose I can sort of segue really nicely then into a question that Claire Moran has posed, sort of about the social stakes in collaboration or not collaboration in the kind of the way that you're talking. So like with Delattre, with Auguste Clos, with these sort of printers, obviously that was sort of something that you touched on in your Cassatt exhibition and in the catalogue. The sort of the classed and gendered stakes in the relationships between an artist and a printer. Could maybe Laurel talk sort of a bit more about that, and Brittany sort of chip in if there's any connections in relation to like ceramic studios or anything like that.
Thanks for the question. I just find it such an interesting thing to think about, and I think the way I think a real reliance on printers among artists in the 19th century, but a real kind of anxiety about that. And that anxiety is where my research sits again. And I think it's because the kind of hand of the printer, especially when that printer is Delattre, that hand that ends up kind of looking like the artist's hand. And so what I'm really interested in is the way that Lepique's, so-called kind of his inky innovations kind of look like they're really about, I mean, they have real aesthetic ends that are quite interesting and, take us, I think, in new directions than Delattre. But I guess, as I said, I'm really interested in the way that they also just allowed him to kind of bypass and kind of negate the figure of the printer and kind of take that social position really out of the equation of printmaking. And he's, as I said, so clear about that. Like he thinks the printer is a kind of unknowing, clumsy, intervening force. And if printing and printmaking is to realize its true aesthetic potential, which he thinks it can, and he can get us there, it's only by one printing one's own plates. And so I'm interested, especially in the ways that those kind of like material developments, formal developments, are often, if not cover for kind of social problems, then at least very imbricated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. Brittany, do you have anything that to sort of
add? No, sorry.
That's okay.
I was lost answering other questions.
You're incredibly diligently answering questions in the Q&A, so thank you very much for that. But yeah, that idea of collaboration is a bit of for some artists, a sort of necessary evil that they're kind of quite desperate to move away from once they can, and how that's informing their practice. There's a really rich question from Jim Rubin, which sort of relates to, I suppose, periodization, and sort of is inviting us to think about the nuances of when we sort of use the term impressionism. His question is sort of how do you both sort of situate your projects in relation to the sort of the shift in emphasis that occurred over the life of Impressionism, away from the sort of the more scientific oriented idea of sort of capturing objectively towards something that's a bit more subjective and sensual and decorative. And so given that sort of latter phase interest in the decorative, how are you situating your thinking in relation to the idea that there's different impressionism sort of coming in sort of sequential phases over the life of the movement? I'm sure I've passed that incredibly clumsily, so any unclarity is entirely due to my quick summary, but hopefully that was sort of clear. Yeah.
No, it's I'll take it on, because that's where I was so intently sort of rereading and musing as Laurel was answering the last question. James, it's not the first time that Roger Marx has come up in the past few months as I've been working on the genesis of this project. And it sounds like from your question, you're agreeing that getting to a multimedia state, Marx's assessment that a multimedia state is really the most, let's say, compassionate, caring, democratic, perhaps in its purest sense of being, and that this arrival at that for so many, this arrival at that right now in 2024 in our research is also a really interesting question to me too. Like, why are we talking about this right now, and what's at stake at present? Is not going unnoticed. I think your point's right. I think if I'm understanding the question as it's written, I have to be really really bold, I guess, in saying that I think the Art Nouveau, as we've written it into 2024, has become increasingly siloed to specific medium and to specific artists. And when we peel back and look at all the people rotating through Siegfried Bing's studio, where he has the new art, it is a multimedia and a global space. So I think returning to look at that space where Art Nouveau is founded is helpful. Just in understanding, why Toulouse-Lautrec and Tiffany are working together. I bet that I need to do more research, though, to understand how the Impressionism transitions towards a more emotive and less technical emphases over sort of 30 or 40 years, too. So I'd be really grateful if you have any suggestions on who to read to really map that transition you're discussing.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to have another go at clumsily synthesizing a couple of questions which have come in from Nathaniel Leclerc and Sarah Hadley, which sort of relate to the sort of, I suppose, the stylistic margins and the sort of the period margins of Impressionism as a term. And so sort of both of them were sort of noticing the sort of Art Nouveau sorts of influences and the kinds of objects, Brittany, that you were showing up. And sort of both of their questions sort of relate to, I suppose, A, what's impressionist about the material that you're looking at? But also B, could we identify a particularly impressionist way of doing intermediality? I.e., are there realist or naturalist artists who are working across media, not only stylistically in a different way, but is there sort of anything sort of qualitatively impressionist in the way that intermediality is happening?
Oh, a good question. I'm thinking about specifically the Bernard and Gauguin piece. I think that harkens exactly to what you're asking about, is when you have someone who's not trained in a medium foraying into another medium, is there something impressionistic specifically that they bring to that medium? And that does, you can find that in, I think, that cabinet's really hard because it's such a pastiche of different subject matter on the same piece too. Forgive me, I have to think longer about that. If there's particularly something impressionistic about the process of translating across medium. If that's what you're asking, I think the presentation got at why individual pieces in their technique or in their subject matter align with Impressionists. You'll also see that I'm specifically I'm not using all of these canonical terms for the various movements. Sometimes they should be used in the case of like Bernard, for example, and his claims to synthetisme and its relationship with multiple materials. But I think that whether or not the process of working across medium is specifically impressionistic is a really great provocation to consider, and I don't have an answer to you yet. No. I did like the questions in the chat that were about have artists always experimented with various materials over time? And yes, you can find examples of that across time. Experimenting with different materials is not specific to artists, and visit a contemporary gallery today, you'll find very much people working with many media. So no, multimedia art is not specific to Impressionism, but Impressionism principles of Impressionism, I think, appear with specific artists working in France in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, and teens. And I think we need to look at them in conversation.
Yeah, well, I've been incredibly rude and asked you a question that I don't know the answer to either. So I wonder, Laurel, I was going to invite Laurel whether there's anything sort of you want to add to that discussion.
I just really love the question, and I think it's going to be really generative to think with. I mean, it also puts pressure on like the way that I've been, in thinking about a potential kind of 19th century French print exhibition or maybe an Impressionist print exhibition. Like, should it only be prints, or should it endeavor to be intermedial in the ways that the exhibitions were? Like in some ways I kind of want to focus just on prints in order to like really think deeply with those. So anyway, I think it's a really helpful question to sort through some of those issues. And it also makes me think about, and this is certainly not something I have an answer to, about like, why is this surfacing now, especially this kind of question about intermedial impressionism? And, I think it's in some ways like, it suits a kind of whatever ongoing material turn in art history. And it could be that the kind of visuality moment of earlier kind of made sense to kind of think about, the kind of scientific optics kind of thing that you were talking about, Samuel. So a kind of historiographic question that I don't think we can answer kind of comes up for me from that question too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, perhaps incredibly fitting then to end a sort of discussion centered on works in progress with an unresolved question that we're all going to take away. Thank you so much for your responses to the discussion. I found it incredibly stimulating. I think just based on the volume of questions that we've had from the audience, lots of people in the room did as well. So thank you very much both for sharing your expertise, for so bravely sharing your work in progress. There's an emotional stake to that I am very much sympathetic to. So thank you very much. Do keep in touch, everybody, with us at impressionistfutures.com. Do feel free to sign up to our newsletter. We'd love to keep in touch. Hopefully we can keep sharing our event program with you through those channels. But thank you once again, Brittany and Laurel, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.